A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't sayin' nothin'. Just don't send me back. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a sound Silas knew better than any human voice, a constant companion that scoured the dust from the hard-packed earth and rattled the single window of his cabin. He stood on his porch, shoulders weary from a day of mending fences that guarded nothing of value. His gaze fixed on the slate evening sky where the sun had bled out, leaving a pale, bruised light. For 5 years, this land had been his penance, a vast and empty church where he served a sentence of silence. The silence inside him was deeper than the quiet of the plains. It was a hollowed-out space where a boy's laughter used to be. He chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces. He worked until exhaustion clouded his mind, leaving no room for the memory of a small, feverish hand growing cold in his own. His life was a routine of endurance. Then he saw them, 2 figures, small and indistinct in the fading light, moving with a slowness that spoke of utter depletion. They were little more than shadows stumbling toward the faint glow of his smoky lamp. He watched, rigid and unmoving, a man who had long ago bolted the door against the world. The woman was thin, her face a mask of dusty exhaustion, but her eyes were alert, like a cornered animal's. Clinging to her worn skirt was a small girl, no older than 5, with wide, dark eyes that took in everything and nothing. They stopped at the edge of his property, a patch of dirt distinguished from the rest of the wilderness only by a rickety fence and the stubborn presence of his cabin. The woman, Ilara, did not speak. She simply stood, a picture of desperate dignity, her body a shield for the child beside her. Silas remained on the porch, his hand resting on the weathered wood of a support beam. He was a stone, an obstacle, another piece of the harsh landscape she had to navigate. The little girl, however, detached herself from her mother's leg and took a single, unsteady step forward. She looked up at the broad-shouldered man, her expression not one of fear, but of simple, profound inquiry. Her voice was a tiny, dry rasp, almost lost to the wind. "Do you also cry from hunger?" she asked. The question struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. It bypassed the walls he had built, the numbness he had cultivated. It was a child's question, honest and raw, and it landed squarely in the hollow space inside him. He didn't cry from hunger for food. He was starving for something else entirely. For a moment, the ghost of his own son, Daniel, stood beside the little girl, his face pale and questioning. He swallowed. He flinched. The world tilted on its axis. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, not in answer to her, but to a memory. His first instinct was to turn away, to retreat into the shell of his solitude and let them be swallowed by the coming night. It was what he had done for years. The world and its sorrows were not his concern. He had enough of his own to carry. But the child's question echoed, a small, clear bell in the cacophony of his grief. He saw the woman's shoulders, so thin beneath her threadbare shawl, and the way she held herself perfectly still, prepared for rejection. She was not begging. She was enduring. A memory flickered in his mind. His wife, Sarah, standing in the doorway, her face etched with worry as Daniel's cough grew worse. He had been too proud, too slow to fetch the doctor from town. By the time he'd returned, it was too late. That hesitation had cost him everything. He would not hesitate again. He didn't say a word. Words were useless things, clumsy and false. Instead, he turned and went inside his cabin. The creak of the floorboards was the only sound. Ilara watched him go, her body tensing, expecting the door to be barred for good. The child crept back to her mother's side. But the door opened again. Silas stood there, holding a tin cup of water in one hand and half a loaf of stale bread in the other. He walked down the 3 porch steps, his footsteps heavy in the dust, and set the offerings on the ground, a safe distance from them. He looked at the woman, his gaze conveying nothing but the simple fact of the transaction. Food. Water. He retreated back to his porch. He remained silent. Ilara stared at the cup and bread as if they were a trap. Her mind, sharpened by years of cruelty and broken promises, searched for the price. Nothing was ever given freely. She had learned that lesson on her skin, in the gnawing emptiness of her stomach. Yet the man simply stood there, a silhouette against the lamplight, his presence as unyielding as the rock formations in the distance. He was not smiling, not leering, not offering false comfort. He was just there. Slowly, she crouched, her movements deliberate and cautious. She picked up the bread and broke off a piece, giving it to the child, who devoured it with a quiet intensity. Only then did Alara take a piece for herself, chewing it slowly, her eyes never leaving the silent man on the porch. He watched them, his face unreadable. He was a man who had forgotten how to feel anything but the dull ache of loss. But now, a strange, unfamiliar sensation stirred within him. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition. He recognized the exhaustion in her posture, the fierce, protective love that made her stand tall even when she was about to collapse. He had felt that same love. He had failed it. He gestured with his head toward the old, disused barn. A dark shape hunched against the twilight. It was little more than a shelter of dry rot and drafts, but it was better than the open plain. "The barn," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Hay is dry." He turned and went back inside his cabin, closing the wooden door with a soft, final click. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. She stayed. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of silent observation. Alara and the child, whose name he learned was Maya, occupied the barn, and he occupied the cabin. They were two separate worlds orbiting the same small patch of desolate earth. He would rise before the sun, the cold air biting at his skin, and go about his chores. He'd fetch water from the well, the clinking of the metal bucket a sharp sound in the morning stillness. He would leave a second bucket of water near the barn door before heading out to check his fences or hunt for game. He never saw her take it, but it was always gone when he returned. She, in turn, created her own sphere of work. She was unobtrusive, a ghost at the edge of his vision. He would see her sweeping the ground in front of the barn with a makeshift broom of twigs, her movements calm and dignified. She found a small spring and washed their few clothes, laying them on sun-bleached rocks to dry. She never approached the cabin. She never spoke to him. She seemed to understand that his solitude was a fragile, carefully constructed thing, and she respected its borders. Her silence was not empty. It was a wall, built of fear and suspicion. She had been passed from one cruel hand to another, and this quiet man's kindness was the most unsettling thing she had ever encountered. She waited for the other shoe to drop, for the demand that would surely come. Her distrust was a physical presence, a cold draft that emanated from the barn. When he returned from hunting with a rabbit, he left it, cleaned and dressed, on a flat stone near her door. He watched from his window as she approached it, her body rigid. She circled it once before snatching it up and disappearing back into the shadows of the barn. There was no nod of thanks, no acknowledgement. There was only the quick, furtive movement of a creature accustomed to scavenging. Silas felt a prick of something, not anger, but a profound sadness. He saw that her spirit had been worn down, her ability to trust ground into dust by the harshness of her life. He understood. He had done the same to himself, closing off his own heart piece by piece until it was as barren as the land around him. They communicated through routine, the bucket of water in the morning, the occasional offering of food, the smoke from her small, carefully tended fire. These were their words, their conversations. He learned the sound of her quiet footsteps, the soft hum she used to soothe Maya to sleep. She learned the rhythm of his axe splitting wood, the heavy sigh he let out when he sat on the porch at dusk, staring at the small, unmarked mound on the hill behind the cabin. They were two lonely souls, living in proximity but separated by a chasm of unspoken pain. One afternoon, he saw that Maya's shoes were falling apart, the thin leather soles flapping uselessly. The ground was hard and cold, littered with sharp stones. The next morning, Alara found a small piece of cured leather, an awl, and a length of waxed thread placed beside the water bucket. She stared at them for a long time, her expression unreadable. She took the tools. He began to help in small, secret ways, cautious interventions that required no interaction. He had an old, thick horse blanket, worn but still warm, stored in his tack room. He'd had it since before Daniel was born. One evening, as the temperature dropped and a frosty air settled over the plains, he took the blanket from its hook. He hesitated, the rough wool a conduit to 1,000 memories. Of wrapping it around Sarah on a cold night, of Daniel building a fort with it on the cabin floor. The past was a physical weight in his hands. He walked quietly to the barn, his footsteps muffled by the dust. He didn't knock. He simply folded the blanket and left it on a wooden crate just outside the door, where she would find it in the morning. He retreated as silently as he had come, feeling like a thief in the night. He was stealing nothing. He was giving a piece of his past away, hoping it could offer some warmth in the present. The next day, he saw the blanket draped over a low beam inside the barn, a patch of deep blue in the shadowy interior. She did not acknowledge the gift. She didn't have to. The fact that she had taken it inside was enough. It was a crack in the wall of her suspicion, a tiny admission that his gestures might not be a prelude to harm. Another day, he noticed her struggling to mend Maya's thin dress with a crude, makeshift needle. That afternoon, he rode into the small, dusty settlement that passed for a town, a place he avoided whenever possible. The looks he received were always the same, a mixture of pity and fear for the silent man who lived alone out in the wastes. He ignored them. He went to the general store and, in his clipped, gravelly voice, asked for a packet of sewing needles and a spool of black thread. He also bought a small sack of flour and some dried beans, items he could have done without but which felt necessary. Back at the homestead, he left the small parcel on the same crate by the barn door. Felt like leaving an offering at a wild shrine. He didn't wait to see her reaction. These acts were not for her, he told himself. They were for him. They were a way of pushing back against the inertia of his grief, a way of doing something, anything, to counter the memory of his own profound failure. He was mending the holes in their lives because he couldn't mend the gaping hole in his own. He chopped more wood than was necessary, stacking it neatly near her dwelling, a bulwark against the coming cold. He was building a fortress of small kindnesses around them, and in doing so, he was unknowingly rebuilding the dilapidated structure of his own humanity. He thought he was just offering a roof for the night. He didn't know he was building a foundation. The separation between them remained, but the space was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken gestures, with the weight of things given and received in silence. The first snow came without warning, a whisper of white that thickened into a blinding curtain. The biting wind howled across the plain, a living thing with a voice of fury, piling drifts against the cabin and the barn. For 2 days, Silas and his silent tenants were sealed in their separate prisons. The world shrank to the space of 4 walls. He kept the stove burning, the warmth a small defiance against the storm's siege. He imagined them in the barn, huddled in the hay, the horse blanket their only shield. The thought was a persistent splinter in his mind. On the 3rd day, the wind quieted, but the cold deepened, cracking the ice in the water bucket with a sharp report. A deep fog settled, erasing the horizon. Late that afternoon, a frantic sound broke the stillness. It was a cry, thin and desperate, followed by a small fist beating against his cabin door. Silas froze. In 5 years, no one had ever come to his door. He opened it to find Maya standing there, her face streaked with tears, her small body trembling violently. "Mama's shaking," she cried, her voice raw with terror. "She won't wake up," for the 2nd time. A child's plea shattered his isolation. He grabbed his heavy coat and followed the girl to the barn. Alara was lying in the hay, wrapped in the blanket, her body racked with shivers. Her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her eyes were closed, lost in the delirium of a high fever. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He carried her through the snow to the cabin, Maya trailing behind, her small hand clutching the hem of his coat. He laid Alara on his own narrow cot, pulling the quilts up to her chin. The cabin, which had always felt like a tomb, was suddenly filled with a terrifying, vibrant life. He had fought this battle before. He had sat by a small bed, bathing a hot forehead, whispering useless reassurances as a fever stole his son. The memory rose in him like bile, hot and suffocating. But this time, paralysis was not an option. He moved with a grim purpose, his actions deliberate and focused. He stoked the fire in the stove until it roared. He melted snow for water, forcing small sips between her cracked lips. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark, an old remedy his mother had taught him. Maya crouched by the fire, a silent, watchful sentinel, her eyes tracking his every move. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was not the silence of solitude, but the tense, shared silence of a vigil. It was the quiet of two people fighting a common enemy. For hours, he sat by the cot, placing cool, damp cloths on Alara's forehead. He spoke to her, his voice a low murmur, the first words he had offered her beyond a bare instruction. "You'll be all right," he said, more to himself than to her. "Just hold on." He was not just fighting for her life. He was wrestling with the ghost of his own failure, trying to win a battle he had already lost once before. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered landscape in pale shades of rose and gray, the fever broke. Her shivering subsided, and her breathing deepened into the calm rhythm of sleep. Silas slumped in his chair, an exhaustion deeper than any physical labor washing over him. He looked at the sleeping woman, at the small child dozing by the hearth, and felt the first tremor of a long-frozen feeling. The ice around his heart was beginning to crack. The snow cleared after a week, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and blindingly white. Alara recovered slowly, her strength returning in small increments. She remained in the cabin, relegated to the cot, while Silas slept on a bedroll by the stove. The forced proximity changed everything. The cabin was too small for them to maintain their distance. They brushed past each other in the narrow space between the table and the hearth. Their hands touched when he passed her a tin cup of broth. These small, accidental contacts were like electric shocks, reminders of a human connection he had long since denied himself. He found himself talking, not much but more than he had in years. He told Maya the names of the birds that came to peck at the crumbs he threw outside. He explained to Alara how to properly bank the fire at night. She listened, her head bowed, but he saw the way her eyes followed him, the suspicion slowly being replaced by a cautious curiosity. She was seeing the man behind the stoic facade, the quiet competence, the suppressed gentleness in the way he handled a frightened bird or a scared child. They needed supplies. The flour was gone, and his stock of dried meat was running low. The trip to town was unavoidable. He hitched his old horse, Bess, to the rickety wagon. He expected Alara to stay behind, but she emerged from the cabin wrapped in the horse blanket, with Maya bundled at her side. "We're coming," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a request. He simply nodded and helped them onto the wagon seat. The ride was silent, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels on the packed snow and the soft snort of the horse. The world felt vast and empty, but for the first time, Silas did not feel alone in it. He felt the small, warm presence of the child beside him, and the quiet, resilient strength of the woman. The town of Redemption was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place where hope came to die. As they pulled up to the general store, heads turned. The townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of surprise and open hostility. They knew Silas, the grieving recluse, but the woman and child were an anomaly, a question mark. Inside the store, the air grew thick with whispered speculation. Silas ignored it, focusing on his list. As he was paying, a large man blocked the doorway, his shadow falling over them. He was broad-shouldered and wore a fine coat, but his eyes were small and cruel. It was Jebediah Thorne, a land baron who owned half the county and believed he owned the people in it, too. His gaze landed on Alara, and a sneer twisted his lips. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he boomed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Thought I told you to stay put, girl. Running off with my property, are you?" Alara flinched as if struck. She pulled Maya behind her, her body becoming a shield once more. She lowered her gaze to the floorboards, her face pale and rigid. The store fell silent. The townsfolk watched, eager for the drama. Thorn took a step closer, his presence suffocating. "Found yourself a new master, have you? This broken-down rancher." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "What did he pay for you?" "Not much. I'd wager the humiliation was a palpable thing. A poison in the air." Silas had been standing by the counter, his back to the scene. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate. He set his sack of flour down. He did not look at Thorn. He looked at Alara, at her trembling shoulders and the terror in Maya's eyes. He saw not a piece of property, but a woman of quiet dignity being stripped bare in public. Something inside him, a long-dormant protective instinct, surged to life. He stepped forward, placing himself between Thorn and Alara. He was not as large as the other man, but he stood like a mountain. He was silent but firm. The crowd held its breath. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "She's with me," he said, his eyes locking with Thorn's. "Not bought." Chosen Jebediah. Thorn's sneer faltered. He looked from Silas's unyielding face to the woman hiding behind him. He had expected fear, submission. He was met with a quiet, immovable force. He scoffed, trying to regain his footing, but the moment was lost. The power had shifted. Defeated, he pushed his way out of the store, muttering threats under his breath. The crowd fell silent. Alara looked up at Silas's back, at the man who had just publicly claimed her, not as an object, but as a choice. A single hot tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He stayed. The ride back to the homestead was a study in charged silence. The air in the wagon was thick with unspoken words, with the aftershock of the confrontation. Maya, sensing the shift, was quiet, her head resting on her mother's lap. Alara sat ramrod straight, staring at the horizon, but her hands, hidden beneath the blanket, were trembling. Silas held the reins, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. He had acted on an impulse he didn't fully understand, a protective instinct that had come from a place he thought long dead. He had spoken more in that one moment than he had in months, and the words echoed in his own ears, foreign and resonant. He had drawn a line in the dust, not just for Thorn, but for himself. He had declared that this woman and this child were under his care, that they mattered. The declaration had changed the landscape between them as surely as a flash flood alters a canyon. The invisible walls of caution and distrust had been washed away, leaving something raw and new in their place. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the snow. The slate evening sky was streaked with violet. He unhitched the horse while Alara took Maya inside. When he was done, he found her waiting for him on the porch. She was standing by the railing, looking out at the vast, lonely expanse, the wind gently stirring the loose strands of her hair. He walked up the steps and stood beside her, not too close, but near enough that he could feel the faint warmth of her presence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind soughed through the dry grass poking through the snow, a lonely, whispering sound. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes clear and direct. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, but not broken. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation, the first time she had offered a direct acknowledgement of his help. He just nodded, unable to form a reply. He wasn't used to gratitude. He felt he didn't deserve it. "No one has ever stood for me before," she added, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were twisting a piece of her worn dress. He swallowed, the knot of his own past tightening in his chest. He looked away from her, his eyes finding the small, snow-dusted mound on the hill. It was an old habit, a constant, painful pilgrimage of the eyes. "I had a son," he said, the words tearing from his throat, rough and painful. His name was Daniel. The confession hung in the cold air between them. He told her everything, the words spilling out in a halting, fragmented rush. The fever, his pride, his hesitation, the agonizing silence of the ride back from town with an empty wagon and a deadened heart. He told her of the grave he had dug with his own hands, and the guilt that had been his only companion since. When he finished, he was breathing heavily, the weight of his unspeakable secret finally released into the world. He felt hollowed out, exposed. He waited for her judgment, for her to turn away from the broken man he was. Instead, she moved closer. Her hand, hesitant at first, came to rest on his arm. It was a simple, gentle touch, skin on rough wool. But in that small gesture, a universe of understanding passed between them. Her touch did not erase his guilt, but it shared its burden. In that moment, on that cold, wind-swung porch, they were no longer two separate souls defined by their suffering. They were no longer alone. As the last of the snow melted, revealing the dark, damp earth, a quiet transformation took place. Spring thawed the land, and with it, the frozen ground of their hearts. The homestead, once a place of exile and penance, began to feel like a place of deliberate living. Their days fell into a new rhythm, one of intertwined purpose. He no longer left offerings by the barn door. They shared their meals at the small wooden table in the cabin. The silence between them was no longer one of distance, but of comfortable companionship, punctuated by the small sounds of their shared existence. The scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the soft thud of a log being placed on the fire, Maya's quiet humming as she played on the floor with wooden blocks he had carved for her. He taught Alara how to shoot, her hands small but steady on the stock of the rifle. She, in turn, showed him how to properly mend his worn shirts, her stitches small and neat, a testament to a life of making do. They worked together to plant a small garden behind the cabin, turning over the soil, their hands sinking into the rich, dark earth. He showed her which seeds to plant, how to read the sun and the soil. As they worked side by side, their movements synchronized, a silent dance of creation. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building. One afternoon, he took Maya up to the hill. He had avoided the grave for years, the sight of it a fresh wound every time. But now, with the small girl's hand in his, the place felt different. It was less a monument to his failure and more a quiet place of memory. He sat on the ground and told Maya about Daniel, about his love for chasing butterflies and the sound of his laughter. He spoke of him not as a ghost, but as a boy who had lived and been loved. Maya listened, her expression serious, and when he was done, she picked a small, wild primrose and placed it gently on the mound of earth. The simple act of tenderness was a balm on his raw soul. He watched Alara from a distance as she went about her chores. He saw the quiet strength in her back, the gentle dignity in her hands. He realized he had stopped seeing her as a survivor he had rescued and had begun to see her simply as Alara. Her presence had become as essential as the air he breathed, a quiet anchor in the lonely sea of his life. The homestead thrived under their combined care. The small garden sprouted green shoots. A sense of order, of home, settled over the place. The creak of the floorboards no longer sounded like a mournful sigh, but like the steady heartbeat of a place coming back to life. Winter had passed, and with it, the long, cold season of their separate griefs. They were not healed, not completely, but they were no longer broken. They were two fractured pieces that, when placed together, had begun to form something whole. Their home was not built with timber and nails, but with shared work, quiet understanding, and the slow, tentative growth of trust. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. This is a story not of grand gestures, but of the small, quiet acts that mend a broken world. It speaks of the dignity of the survivor and the redemption of the penitent. It is a testament to the truth that the deepest connections are often forged not in words, but in shared silence, in the mutual recognition of pain and the steadfast refusal to let it be the final word. Love grows where no one looks, tended by the invisible hands of kindness and endurance. He didn't know it yet, but the family he thought he had lost forever was being rebuilt. Right in front of him, one quiet day at a time. The narrator senses and says it aloud. What he was truly building was not a homestead, but a future. He thought he was offering shelter from a storm, but he was the one being brought in from the cold. Her resilience was the fire that thawed his frozen heart. His quiet protection was the roof that allowed her to finally feel safe. They were saving each other without even knowing it, their unspoken needs meeting in the vast, quiet wilderness. The days grew longer, the sun lingering in the sky, bathing the plains in a warm, golden light. Silas found himself on the porch most evenings, not staring at the grave on the hill, but carving a piece of cottonwood. He worked slowly, deliberately, the shavings falling around his boots like soft, pale snow. He was making a small rocker, its lines simple and honest. It was for Maya. He wanted her to have a place of her own, a piece of comfort in a world that had offered her so little. He sanded the wood until it was smooth as river stone, its surface warm to the touch. The act of creation was a quiet prayer, a shaping of a better future from the raw material of the present. When it was finished, he didn't present it with any fanfare. He simply brought it inside one evening and placed it by the stove, in the warm circle of firelight. Maya's eyes grew wide. She approached it cautiously, running a small hand over the curved back. She looked from the rocker to Silas, a question in her eyes. He just nodded. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face, and she climbed into the chair, rocking gently back and forth, a picture of pure, simple contentment. The cabin window was open, letting in the sweet scent of new grass and the distant sound of night birds. The air was soft and full of promise. Alara stood in the doorway, watching the scene, a quiet, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. She looked at Silas, her gaze holding a depth of feeling that no words could ever capture. He met her look, his own eyes clear and steady for the first time in years. The guilt had not vanished, but it no longer defined him. It was a part of his story, but not the end of it. He gestured with his hand, a small movement that encompassed the cabin, the garden, the land, the life they were building together. "Stay here," he said. The words were not a command, not a question, but a simple, heartfelt statement. It was the only thing that needed to be said. She nodded. She stayed. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. We'll see you again, where silence means home.